This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to the 17th episode of the Naked Mormonism podcast. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last historical episode was a bit of a doozy. We covered the View of the Hebrews authorship theory, which was completely separate from the Solomon Spaulding authorship theory for the Book of Mormon. The View of the Hebrews was a book written in 1823 by a man named Ethan Smith, and actually underwent a second edition printing in 1825. The timeline of its authorship, juxtaposed to Joe's story with the Book of Mormon being translated, seemed to have a lot of coincidences. This theory of authorship is espoused by most critical Mormon scholars today, as it is the most compelling and evidence-based theory of any that have been proposed so far. But the View of the Hebrews, being a primary source material for the Book of Mormon, wasn't the only thing we covered that episode. There are almost 800 verifiable anachronistic plagiarisms directly from the Old and New Testaments. And the names of the geography in the Book of Mormon directly reflect an early 19th century map of New England and the surrounding areas. This was probably a map that Joe would have had access to during one of his multiple brief stints in schooling while he was growing up. These were only a few of many sources listed. The possibilities can go on for days. Well, that episode finished out with a list of dozens of possible source material books that were written anywhere from 150 years before Joe was born up to just a couple years or even months before Joe's Book of Mormon dropped. Based off the abundance of evidence for the source material of the Book of Mormon, we can easily ascertain that it was by no means an original book. That being said, I don't think we have standing to claim that any one of these sources was the single primary source for the Book of Mormon. While Joe definitely took more material from some sources than he did from others, there's really no way of telling all the materials he pulled from. I think Joe was one of the great information synthesizers of his day. He was capable of reading something and retaining the information quite well, and then he expounded upon whatever it was that he learned. The Book of Mormon is merely the manifestation of what was going on inside Joe's mind at the time, and a reflection of his beliefs and worldview. Personally, I believe that the manuscript found by Solomon Spaulding was the source that Joe pulled most of the form and structure of the Book of Mormon from, while the theology contained in the Book of Mormon probably came from the View of the Hebrews and other books or preachers or anybody else that were popular in the burned over district during the time leading up to authoring the Book of Mormon. That being said, there's one massive chink in the armor of the Spaulding theory. That is the lack of tangible manuscript evidence. We don't have a copy of the source text known as manuscript found, as it's believed to have been squirreled away or burned by Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. That's why the View of the Hebrews stands above the Spaulding theory in most scholarly realms. There are thousands of copies of the View of the Hebrews in existence still, and we can compare it apples to apples with the Book of Mormon, as opposed to in direct comparison with the Spaulding manuscript. There are so many things to talk about when it comes to the authorship and the content in the Book of Mormon. I can scarcely wrap my mind around everything that I need to talk about with it. I don't even understand a lot of the ins and outs of what lies inside that gold-lettered blue-bound tome of fairy tales. That being said, there's way more actual history to get to without focusing on the book itself. So this is what we have to focus on. I'm not going to dive all the way into the content of the Book of Mormon because there's literally way too much to talk about in there, and it seems to get really dry. So what I'll do instead is continue on with the history and the timeline of Joseph Smith and how the book was actually written, so we can advance the timeline of the actual relevant people. Don't think that I'm ignoring everything that needs to be talked about when it comes to the Book of Mormon. There's enough there to fill dozens of hours of podcasting time. But, like I said, examining the Book of Mormon with that level of detail gets overbearing and dry really quickly. So what I've decided to do is continue in the timeline itself and revisit the Book of Mormon authorship once we know a little bit more about Joe and the other people that were involved in the book. I'll probably end up doing the Book of Mormon analysis as like separate special edition episodes or something like that, just to keep the main timeline of the people and the history of the church separate from the analysis of the Book of Mormon. Maybe, if patronage gets to be enough, I'll release a short episode every other week talking about just the Book of Mormon itself, but we'll see. Well, let's get into the actual history and what we're covering in today's episode by talking about the newlyweds, Joseph Smith and Emma Hale Smith. The last time we were talking about these two, Joe had just pulled the 200-plus pound plates out of the ground and ran home with them under his arm. He encountered a few dudes that were way bigger than him, two of which had guns, yet Joe was able to knock them the fuck out with a couple God-mode superpower punches. Once Joe had the plates safely home in Palmyra, he and Emma experienced a ton of quote-unquote persecution from Joe's fellow treasure diggers that all reckoned Joe owed them a piece of the plates. The phrase, "there's no honor among thieves," does seem to fit the situation quite well. Joe embraced the meaning of this phrase by quote-unquote borrowing $50 from not-so-smarty Martin Harris so he and Emma could move in with the Hale family in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and escape the persistent inquisition of the local vagabonds. When Joe and Emma moved into the Hale residence, Isaac Hale, Emma's dad, had a condition or two that needed to be met. So let's hear what he has to say. This is from Isaac Hale's affidavit in Mormonism Unveiled by E.D. Howe in 1834. Quote, "Smith stated to me that he had given up what he called glass-looking, and that he expected to work hard for a living, and was willing to do so. He also made arrangements with my son, Alva Hale, to go to Palmyra, and move his furniture, etc., to this place. He then returned to Palmyra, and soon after, Alva, agreeable to the arrangement, went up and returned with Smith and his family. Soon after this, I was informed they had brought a wonderful book of plates down with them. I was shown a box in which it is said they were contained, which had, to all appearances, been used as a glass box of the common-sized window glass. I was allowed to feel the weight of the box, and they gave me to understand that the book of plates was in the box, into which, however, I was not allowed to look." End quote. So I've actually quoted this before, little snippets here and there, but there's a lot more to this affidavit, and we're really going to get into that for today's episode. In fact, it's going to advance our storyline through most of the episode. Still quoting from Isaac's affidavit, quote, "I inquired of Joseph Smith, Jr., who was to be the first who would be allowed to see the book of plates. He said it was a young child. After this, I became dissatisfied and informed him that if there was anything in my house of that description which I could not be allowed to see, he must take it away. If he did not, I was determined to see it. After that, the plates were said to be hid in the woods." End quote. That was a real smooth move by Joe there. Isaac said that he wanted to see the plates, so Joe let him hold the box that the plates were supposedly in, but wouldn't let him sneak a peek. After that didn't satisfy Isaac, he told Joe that he wouldn't allow him to keep such a thing in his house if Isaac could see and examine the plates for himself. So what did Joe do? He supposedly hid them in the woods, and effectively the entire translation was done without the plates in the same room as Joe at any time. Joe must have been a pretty shady guy from the Hale family perspective, but of course Emma had her love-tinted glasses on and couldn't see Joe for what he really was. If only she would have taken a step back and looked at the situation objectively for a moment, or would have listened to her family when they talked about Joe, she might not have gotten into the situation she eventually ended up in. But apparently tensions were pretty high in the Hale household, with Joe living there. To help illustrate this point, let's hear what Alva Hale, who was Emma's brother, had to say about the situation. This is quoted from Alpha Hale's affidavit, which is also in Mormonism Unveiled by E.D. Howe. Quote, Joseph Smith Jr. told him that his gift in seeing with a stone and hat was a gift from God, but also states that Smith told him at another time that this peeking was all damned nonsense. He was deceived himself, but did not intend to deceive others, that he intended to quit the business of peeping and labor for his livelihood, that afterwards Smith told him he should see the plates from which he translated the Book of Mormon, and accordingly at the time specified by Smith, he, meaning Alva, of course, called to see the plates, but Smith did not show them, but appeared angry. He further states that he knows Joseph Smith Jr. to be an impostor and a liar, and knows Martin Harris to be a liar likewise. End quote. So, I'm pulling a lot of these from Mormonism Unveiled, and this was just a few pages after Isaac Hale's testimony. This just shows that Alva didn't like Joe or Not So Smarty Marty any more than any of the other Hales did, with, well, the exception of Emma, of course, she was smitten. Joe's presence seemed to anger most people in the family. So what turned out to be the best solution in Isaac's opinion? Well, kicking Joe out. But Emma wouldn't stay without Joe, so an agreement was made. Emma and Joe would buy and move into the vacant home of Jesse Hale, who had recently moved to Illinois, which was on one corner of the Hale property. This allowed Isaac and the rest of the Hales to keep an eye on Emma while they got to know Joe a little bit better. Once they moved into this house, Emma became the first unofficial scribe for Joe. I'm not sure exactly what happened directly after this, as it's easy to lose the truth in the muddled testimonies of the Hale family versus that of Joe, but what we do know is Not So Smarty Marty swooped in to become the first official scribe for Joe, soon after Emma called it quits. It may have been because Isaac didn't approve of Emma being the scribe for Joe's evil book, as he later described it, or it may have been by persuasion from Marty himself for want of oversight. The catalyst for Marty's presence isn't very clear, but we do know that he showed up shortly after Emma and Joe moved into their new home in order to finance and help with the translation. Let's hear what happened next from more of Isaac's 1834 testimony in Mormonism Unveiled. Quote, about this time, Martin Harris made his appearance upon the stage, and Smith began to interpret the characters or hieroglyphs which he said were engraven upon the plates, while Harris wrote down the interpretation. It was said that Harris wrote down 116 pages and lost them. End quote. This quote was referring to the point in time when Marty took the 116 pages they had completed home to his wife, Lucy Harris. We'll let Isaac advance us further into the storyline in a minute here, because he's, doing such a good job of it. But for now, let's get the 116-page manuscript story out in the open to find out what really happened. I'm taking this story directly from the LDS.org website article on the topic, as it seems to tell the story as reported from a believing Mormon perspective quite succinctly. Quote, from mid-April to mid-June 1828, the prophet Joseph Smith was translating the gold plates while living in Harmony, Pennsylvania. A wealthy farmer and businessman named Martin Harris was acting as scribe while Joe translated the Book of Mormon. Martin was 22 years older than Joseph and had given Joseph and Emma $50, which was a substantial amount of money at the time, to relocate to Harmony, where Emma's family lived, thus helping to support Joseph while he translated the plates. In February 1828, Joseph allowed Martin to take copies of characters from the plates to be authenticated by two professors in New York City, Dr. Mitchell and Charles Anthon. Lucy Harris, Martin's wife, had become increasingly concerned about Martin's interest and financial involvement in the translation of the plates. She and others began to pressure Martin for evidence of the plates' existence. To satisfy their concerns, in mid-June, Martin requested that Joseph allowed him to take the 116 pages of manuscript they had completed to show as evidence. End quote. Then it references Doctrine and Covenants, section 3, verse 1 through 3, and relates a hypothetical for the readers of this article. Listen to how it's written. The article is titled, Joseph Smith Learns That the Work of God Cannot Be Frustrated. I'm not sure exactly what that means, because if humans can frustrate God or his work, it's a rather petty God and probably isn't worthy of worship, but that's beside the point. So the article continues, quote, think of situations when you might be tempted to listen to a friend rather than follow the counsel or commandments of Heavenly Father. For instance, you might be tempted to allow a friend to copy your homework, or be tempted to watch an inappropriate movie or video on the internet with your friends. I have never watched internet porn with a friend before. It gets way too awkward when you whip it out. Why is it sometimes difficult to resist friends when they ask you to do something you know is wrong? By mid-June 1828, the prophet Joseph Smith, with Martin Harris as scribe, had translated 116 pages of manuscript from the golden plates. Martin asked Joseph to allow him to take the manuscript to read to his friends, that perhaps he might convince them of the truth. Joseph approached the Lord with Martin's request, but was told not to let the manuscript out of his possession. Martin convinced Joseph to ask again, which resulted in a second refusal from the Lord. Martin prevailed upon Joseph to ask once more, and, on this third request, the Lord gave permission for Martin to take the manuscript if he agreed to show the manuscript only to his wife and a few select family members. Wait, what? Wasn't the premise of this article not listening to the temptation of your peers? It kind of sounds like God had nothing to do with granting permission here, but Joe might have just been listening to his friend Not So Smarty Marty and caved. Besides, what bargaining chip did Joe have when it came to persuading Marty to continue the work? Marty was the one with the money to finance the publication of the book. I mean, doesn't make any sense. However, Martin broke his oath and the manuscript was lost, because Joseph had not accepted the Lord's initial counsel, but delivered that which was sacred into the hands of a wicked man. That's quoting Doctrine and Covenants. Moroni took the plates and the Urim and Thummim from the prophet. However, Joseph was told that he could receive them again if he would be humble and penitent. End quote. So any Nevermos that are listening probably didn't pick up on it, but I sure felt it. That article was written in the same exact way that a bishop would chastise you for watching a rated R movie at a party. I don't know what it is or how to explain or quantify it, but reading this article in the writing style that it was written in just made my blood boil with recollections of bully pulpit chastening from every church leader that taught with these bullshit metaphors. I mean, I'm sorry for this digression, but I thought it was worth mentioning how mad this made me, without even knowing exactly why. It's just the style that it's written in. It seems so demeaning, like they're scolding a child. So let's talk about the content in the article itself, with, emotions aside. What exactly happened here? Basically, Not So Smarty Marty's wife was incredulous about the reality of the plates and the Book of Mormon as far as it had been translated, so she demanded that Marty get the plates from Joe. She wasn't buying the bullshit and wanted to see some goddamn gold that this punk from Palmyra had supposedly found. Well, Marty asked for the plates, and Joe obviously turned him down because Joe's set was way more makeshift and shitty than would pass any scrutinizing inspection from anybody. But Marty was able to convince Joe to let the 116-page manuscript, which comprised the Book of Lehi, out of his hands for a couple weeks so Marty could take it home and show it to Lucy. Well, like we learned previously, she didn't buy it and probably hid them or tossed them into flames when Marty wasn't looking. This supposedly caused the angel Moroni to get pissed off and take away Joe's ability to translate the plates, quote-unquote, for a season. But along came Mr. Oliver Cowdery, heretofore and henceforth referred to as Cowdung All Over, or Ollie for short. As soon as Ollie came along, the angel Moroni magically granted Joe the ability to translate again, and boy oh boy did he. Ollie moved into the newlywed home with Emma and Joe, and the authorship went apeshit nutballs. So let me pause for a second to cover the dates up to this point. I want to offer some perspective of the order of events. Joe had reportedly received the plates on or about September 21st, 1827. He didn't actually take them home yet. He just dug them out of the stone box that was in the ground and reportedly hid them in a stump or a log or something. 10 days later, when Joe was out of town, Emma rode to where Joe was working and told him that the plates might be in danger because, well, the treasure digging group had hired a guy named Samuel Lawrence to help them seek out the plates while Joe was, out of town working. This was a big fucking problem. If you remember, Samuel Lawrence was the guy who went with Joe to Hill Cumorah a couple of years earlier and persuaded Joe to say that he saw a pair of specs, or spectacles, buried in the stone box along with the plates. In reaction to Lawrence being the ringer to help the treasure diggers find the plates, Joe went back home to bring the plates to the Smith residence safe and sound, without Samuel Lawrence or any other money diggers harming him or the plates. He did this despite walking the plates 3 miles through the forest at night and being attacked by 3 guys. Joe did actually get hurt a little bit when these guys attacked him. He actually dislocated his thumb when he knocked out the last guy with his final super punch of doom. The next few weeks were hell for the Smith family, especially the newlyweds. The treasure diggers never stopped trying to get a hold of the plates. They even hired somebody named Sally Chase, who was a sister of Willard and Mason Chase, with her vibrant green seer stone to help them find the box the plates were supposedly in, while they were stashed under the floorboard of the cooper shop that was on the Smith's property. This so-called persecution made Joe consent to moving in with the in-laws in November of 1827. At this time, Not-So-Smarty Marty gave Joe $50 to help Joe pay off some of his debts and move to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Marty gave them a couple of months to settle in. They originally moved into the Hale household, but tensions were too high, as we found out from Isaac and Alva's testimonies. So Joe and Emma moved into Jesse's house, probably in January of 1828. In February, Marty decided to swing by and discuss something with Joe that should have been Joe's downfall. Joe gave Marty the characters manuscript for Marty to take up to Columbia University to have Not-So-Smarty Marty Super Study Smarty Party Pooper pal Charlie Anthon verify the writing as ancient something. Fill in the blank, I guess. We covered all the details of this interaction in episode 4, so I'm not going to rehash it here. It's just worth mentioning that this is when it comes up in the timeline. All that matters here is that Marty should have known at this point that Joe was full of monkey shit, but for some reason, the red flags just didn't stop Marty in his blind greed to publish this book and make money off of it. During this time that Not-So-Smarty Marty was in New York learning that Joe was a fraud, Joe attempted to use Emma and her little brother as scribes for translating the Book of Mormon. But something didn't work out because we don't have any writings from this period in time. It may have made up the first couple of chapters of the Book of Lehi, but there's really no way of knowing what they wrote down or why Joe couldn't continue to use them as scribes. It may have had something to do with Emma being, 6 months pregnant at the time, or it may have been intervention from Joe's father-in-law, Isaac Hale, or, all the members of the Hale family for that matter. So, enter Not-So-Smarty Marty once again. He had returned from his New York trip, reportedly satisfied with the authenticity of Joe's characters manuscript. I say reportedly because we only have record of Marty's side of this meeting from the Joseph Smith history, which is actually included as part of the Mormon canon. Whether or not Marty was satisfied with how legit Joe was at this time didn't seem to affect Marty's motivations. What we can surmise is he must not have been satisfied with their persistence in translating the book up to this point. So, Marty basically moved in with them and arduously translated day after day. They started this work in April. We aren't sure of the exact day here, but it's reported as April 12th, 1828. Joe and Marty plug away and get the entire Book of Lehi translated, which comprised the 116-page manuscript. They finished on June 14th, 1828, meaning they translated anywhere from 1.5 to 2 pages per day. In comparison to progress with Emma and her brother, Joe and Marty must have been cooking balls. Once they were done, Marty begged to take the 116 pages to show his wife. After a lot of persistence, he got permission from Joe, or God, or somebody, and ended up losing them. Or they were stolen by Lucy Harris, or another family member, or some homeless guy. We don't know. It's just too muddled. The next piece in this series of events gets even more muddy. So we're going to let Isaac Hale advance our narrative up until Ollie swoops in to save the day by becoming the next official scribe. This is still quoting from Isaac Hale's affidavit in Mormonism Unveiled. Quote, "Soon after this happened," meaning losing the 116 pages, "Martin Harris informed me that he must have a greater witness, and said that he had talked with Joseph about it. Joseph informed him that he could not, or durst not, show him the plates, but that he would go into the woods where the book of plates was, and that after he came back, Harris should follow his track in the snow and find the book and examine it for himself. Harris informed me afterwards that he followed Smith's directions and could not find the plates and was still dissatisfied." End quote. Imagine fucking that. Joe was notorious for these little tricks. He probably told Marty that if he had enough faith in the Lord, he would be able to see the plates to satisfy his curiosity. This wasn't the only time something like this happened. The further we get along, we'll find out just how much Joe set things up like this so he couldn't be the one to fail. If somebody wasn't satisfied with the prophet Joseph Smith's claims, it was due to their lack of faith and was therefore their problem. Joe was a diabolical menace when it came to stuff like this. So obviously, Marty wasn't deterred by the ridiculousness of this little stunt because, well, we're talking about it today. And if he wouldn't have been satisfied with it, he never would have gone through with financing the publishing of the Book of Mormon. So let's find out what happened next. Still from Isaac Hale, quote, "The next day after this happened, I went to the house where Joseph Smith Jr. lived, and where he and Harris were engaged in their translation of the book. Each of them had written a piece of paper which they were comparing, and some of the words were, quote, 'My servant seeketh a greater witness, but no greater witness can be given him,' end quote. There was also something said about, quote, 3 that were to see the thing," end quote, meaning, I suppose, the Book of Plates, and that, quote, "if the 3 did not go exactly according to the orders, the thing would be taken from them," end quote. I inquired whose words they were, and was informed by Joseph or Emma, I rather think it was the former, that they were the words of Jesus Christ. I told them then that I considered the whole of it a delusion, and advised them to abandon it. End quote. Okay, so we have this little stunt that Joe pulled. After Marty lost 116 pages, he wanted to find a greater witness of the authenticity of the plates. So what Joe did was told Marty that, hey, I'm going to walk out into the forest and make sure that the plates are there. And then when I come back, you follow my footsteps into the forest and you'll be able to find them wherever my footprints end. Well, of course, because it was all fucking made up in Joe's head, Marty didn't find them. So Marty continued persisting, I need a greater witness. I need to see something more. Come on, Joe, convince me that you are a prophet for real. I want to be convinced of this. So Joe came up with revelation that said, quote, my servant seeketh a greater witness, but no greater witness can be given him, end quote. Do you see how Joe was able to just weasel out of a corner that he was forced into? And somehow people all the time would logically corner Joe to the point that he had no possible out, and then he would come up with some kind of divine revelation from God that would get him out of the jam. We've talked about him doing this quite a few times, and this wasn't his first or anywhere near his last time that he did this with Marty. So let's take a second to review who Joe had said could see the plates up to this point. According to Peter Ingersoll, when Joe first brought the plates home, the family supposedly asked to see them. Remember this story? I might have actually read this as bonus content, but supposedly Peter reported he was talking to Joe, and Joe had found some white sand or something to that effect, so he collected it in his jacket and threw it over his shoulder and walked home. And when he arrived home, his family was like, oh, fuck, what do you have there, Joe? And he's like, well, I got the plates here, and you guys want to see them? So after the family had supposedly asked to see them, Joe fed them the line of, you can see them, but God will probably destroy you if you look at them. Like some Indiana Jones Ark of the Covenant shit. So everybody around the table was like, oh, no, okay, we don't have to see them. It's all good. But they were able to lift the plates and feel how heavy they were. But every time that they really examined them, they were always wrapped in a jacket or a cloth. Before that, however, Joe had said that on September 21st, 1827, Emma would be the one to help him get the plates, effectively meaning she would be the first to see the plates. But before 1827, Joe said that it would be his eldest brother Alvin who would help him get the plates out of the ground, meaning that Alvin would have been the first person other than Joe to see the plates. But Alvin died in 1825, so Joe said that the person who would see the plates and help him dig them up out of the ground would be revealed to him at a later date. This person turned out to be Samuel Lawrence, who we talked about earlier, who went with Joe to the top of Hill Cumorah and helped him see the specks with the plates in the stone box. This would have made Lawrence the first person that got to see the plates other than Joe, and he was just a family friend and fellow money digger. Nobody really important. After all of this, Isaac Hale asked to see the plates, and Joe said that the Lord told him the first person to see the plates would be a child. We can reasonably assume that Joe was referring to his own little squirt that was growing in Emma's tummy when he said this. But their highly deformed baby died a few hours after childbirth, so nobody was buying that line anymore. Next, Marty asked to see the plates, and Joe put him through this bullshit shenanigan of following Joe's footprints in the snow into the woods to hopefully have God reveal the plates to him. When every single last one of these ploys failed to satisfy anybody's curiosity about the plates and authenticate Joe, Joe told everybody that God would reveal the plates to 3 witnesses, which ended up being a statement that Joe drafted up and had the 3 witnesses sign. We'll probably get into that next episode. If we're trying to keep a prophetic scorecard for Joe here, he's got a big fat fucking bagel on his side of the tallies. How many times did he have to pull this smoke and mirrors shit with these people before they finally gave up on him? Does this sound like the workings of an almighty, all-knowing God, or just the actions of a habitual liar with a megalomaniacal God complex? Speaking of habitual lying, let's read the next thing in Isaac Hill's affidavit talking about Joe. Quote, the manner in which he pretended to read and interpret was the same as when he looked for the money diggers, with the stone in his hat and his hat over his face, while the book of plates were at the same time in the woods. End quote. A person may wonder how Isaac knew the details of Joe's method of money digging. Remember, the Hale residence is where the whole treasure-seeking crew stayed when they were hired by bossman Josiah Stowell to look for the Spanish silver mine along the banks of the Susquehanna River. That was when Joe met Emma back in late 1825, right before his trial in 1826. That was a lawsuit brought about by bossman Josiah Stubble's family. Isaac must have hated Joe's lying face every time he saw it, and Isaac was one of multiple people that reported Joe translating the plates by looking at Precious and Mr. Hat in the same exact way he spent most of his time looking for buried treasure, which method he was arrested and went to trial for. So he was so clearly a fraud, and we can see this by July 1828, before he even started composing the Book of Mormon with the help of Ollie, and, well, everybody else that helped him out later. It doesn't even take opening up the Book of Mormon itself to realize how much of a flim-flamming fuck Joe was. So Isaac's doing such a great job of moving us along, let's just leave him to do his thing. Quote, "After this, Martin Harris went away, and Oliver Cowdery came and wrote for Smith, while he interpreted as above described. This is the same Oliver Cowdery whose name may be found in the Book of Mormon," meaning one of the three witnesses. "Cowdery continued as a scribe for Smith until the Book of Mormon was completed, as I supposed and understood." End quote. That brought us up to where Ollie came to live with Emma and Joe in their newly purchased house. But there were a couple of interesting things that happened in that interim period from July 1828 to April 5th, 1829, when Ollie showed up to help scribe. There's one more paragraph of Isaac Hale's affidavit, and we'll finish it momentarily, but we have to cover that period that he glossed over right there. After Not So Smarty Marty lost the 116 pages, God supposedly became angry with him and Joe and directed the angel Moroni to take the plates, along with the Urim and Thummim translators, away from Joe. I personally believe this was just a cop-out. I mean, let's face it, it was. Let me propose what I actually think happened. The common consensus is that Lucy Harris took the 116-page manuscript and burned it, or gave it to a friend to hold on to. While this does make sense, I think there's a possibility that Marty might have had a little more to do with it than historically portrayed. Think about it. Wise businessmen try and vindicate the person they're about to go into business with. And let's face it, Marty might have been trying to do the same thing, and then blamed his bitch of a wife when things didn't turn out like he expected. What I mean is, Joe and Marty had just spent the last 2 months straight writing these 116 pages. Do you really think that Marty would just let them out of his sight? Or do you think that he had a scenario in his mind of what a real prophet would have done? If Joe were a real prophet translating from real plates, he would be able to recreate everything that they had just spent their time composing word for word. But if he was a liar, then his mortal memory would never have been up to the task of recreating the entire 116-page Book of Lehi. I personally believe that Lucy and Not So Smarty Marty came up with this handy little scheme to authenticate Joe. I am willing to bet that if Joe had started translating again and perfectly recreated word for word the first few chapters of the Book of Lehi, Not So Smarty Marty might have just pulled the 116 pages out of his jacket pocket and told Joe, "I just wanted to make sure that this book is indeed from God." I think that we might sell Marty short if we consider his wife to be the only person responsible for this clever little ploy. Because, let's face it, Marty was a businessman. He may have been a crazy, delusional, God-fearing psycho, but he was smart with his business dealings. That's what we can gather from all the people that knew him. But instead of gaining the verification that Marty was looking for, he got the runaround from Joe every which way till Sunday and never ended up completely satisfied. So, what did Joe do? He cooked up a story about God being pissed off about Marty losing the pages and taking away Joe's toys for a season. Joe was probably able to use his kid dying as an excuse to not work on the plates for a while, and Marty ended up going home to Manchester, New York, empty-handed with his pockets lighter than when he left for Harmony. Not only that, but Marty was a prolific farmer in Manchester. Most farmers would say that the most important season of the year is springtime. If you don't keep to the schedule of getting your crops in the ground in spring, the entire season is fucked. Well, Marty had just spent all of April, May, and June scribing for Joe. The consequences of this are borne out in Lucy Mack's personal memoir on page 132, wherein she claimed that 2/3 of Not So Smarty Marty's crop was lost. She claimed that it was destroyed by a thick fog that seemed to signify God's wrath for losing the manuscript, but it could also be because Marty was completely neglecting his farm all spring long, because it was, well, almost 300 miles away from Harmony, Pennsylvania. He just wanted to hang out with Joe and chase the big bucks with Joe's new Jesus book. But Marty's unwilling butt-fucking didn't stop with lost time, money, and crops. Joe and Emma were living off Marty's dime the entire time he was there, which adds up after a while. Not only during Marty's stay at their house, but also during a lot of Ollie's stay with Joe and Emma. Marty financially backed every single thing that the team needed from 1827 all the way until he gave up on the translation in the summer of 1828. Joe just bled Marty dry. But honestly, when I take a step back, I have a hard time feeling bad for Marty. He may have been the victim here, but the red flags were all over the place. He was living in a sea of red flags. And at some point, we have to hold Marty responsible for being the unwitting fuckwit he really was. To help illustrate this point, let's finish the last paragraph of Isaac's affidavit. Quote, Joseph Smith Jr. resided near me for some time after this, and I had a good opportunity of becoming acquainted with him, and somewhat acquainted with his associates. And I conscientiously believe from the facts I have detailed, and from many other circumstances which I do not deem it necessary to relate, that the whole Book of Mormon is a silly fabrication of falsehood and wickedness, got up for speculation, and with a design to dupe the credulous and unwary, and in order that its fabricators might live upon the spoils of those who swallowed the deception. End quote. God damn, live upon the spoils of those who swallowed the deception. Holy fuck, if only Isaac could see then the church that little fucking book made today, 187 years after Joe and Marty teamed up, it would blow his fucking mind. If we're trying to keep track of the prophetic scorecard here, so far, Isaac Hale just destroyed Joe's record of, well, fucking 0 in one paragraph. One other thing that happened in this time before Ollie came along to be the second official scribe was an occurrence that seems so small and insignificant that it scarcely bears repeating. But the implications of it, once we take a step back, are that of total destruction of Joe's 1838 testimony of the first visitation. Follow me down this rabbit hole for just a second, then we'll talk about Ollie scribing for Joe. Joe was understandably depressed by the summer of 1828. Marty had just lost the 116 pages they worked on so hard for the past 2 months. Joe was having a hard time coming up with more and more schemes to make Marty believe that he was for real, or at least to pacify Marty's concerns. Isaac Hale, Joe's father-in-law, hated Joe and didn't want him anywhere near his daughter Emma, and the tension throughout the family must have been palpable with every interaction they had. Joe was in debt to his father-in-law for the house that they were all living in, but hated doing manual labor, which would have been the most sensible means to pay off the note. He had promised Isaac that he would quit the treasure digging business, which was the one thing that bound Joe to all of his friends back home. And not only his friends, but his entire lifestyle up to that point had been magic and treasure seeking in a completely magical worldview. And then, to top off all of these pressures, his first son died a few hours after childbirth, spiraling the young newlywed family into a depression, which effectively ripped a Jesus-sized hole in their souls that only a real church could fix. So, Joe signed up for the United Methodist Church in Harmony. This was the church that Emma had been attending with the entire Hale family for most of her growing up years. Pastors in that day served as the local psychiatrist, spiritual counselor, and God conduit to help people repent for their sins or find their way back to Jesus or solve any problem they had. They were like the local Walmart of fixes for the human condition. Joe, being the God-fearing young man he was, probably reckoned that everything conspiring against him was symptomatic of Satan taking over his life. Or maybe he was just falling away from God and needed a little spiritual direction. So, he joined this church. Why the hell would we care if Joe joined a Methodist church? I would like to take this opportunity to refer everybody to Joe's account of the first vision contained in the Joseph Smith history, which, as I stated earlier, is part of the Mormon canon. I'm going to begin reading a little ways into verse 17 and go to the middle of verse 20. Keep in mind, this was recorded happening in spring of 1820, before all of the whole bullshit gold plate business started, and it was actually written by Joe himself. Quote, "When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages, whose brightness and glory defy all description, standing above me in the air. One of them spake unto me, calling me by name, and said, pointing to the other, This is my beloved Son, hear him. My object in going to inquire of the Lord was to know which of all the sects was right, that I might know which to join. No sooner, therefore, did I get possession of myself so as to be able to speak, than I asked the personages who stood above me in the light, which of all the sects was right. For at this time it had never entered into my heart that all were wrong, and which I should join. I was answered that I must join none of them, for they were all wrong. And the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination in his sight, that the professors were all corrupt, that, this is quoting Jesus now, they draw near to me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They teach for doctrines and commandments of men, having a form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. End quoting Jesus. He again forbade me to join with any of them, and many other things did he say unto me, which I cannot write at this time. End quote. Okay, so what happened here is, at the age of 14, Joe supposedly went into the woods to ask God which church he should join. And Jesus himself in person, with God the Father standing next to him, forbade Joe from joining any other church. Forbade! Does Joe know what that means? Being the skeptic that I am, if God and Jesus were to descend from the clouds over my head, I would listen to whatever the fuck they had to say. After the spell, I'd, probably try to find more of whatever it was that I was on. But if this happened for real, and then I was given some gold plates and a chest plate with some magic glasses, all by the power of this God that descended in the clouds above me, I would do whatever the fuck those personages told me to do. You would have to kill me before I denied what happened and disobeyed the wishes of these gods. But Joe, the prophet of the restoration of the true gospel of Jesus Christ, directly contradicted what Jesus supposedly told him in person. I have to admit, Joe is really good at shooting himself in the foot when it comes to revelations that contradict themselves, or just reality in general, but I guess I can't really blame him. He was going through a tough time and probably needed a sense of community, and church is really good for that. Besides, the first vision story wasn't recorded until 1838. How the hell would Joe be able to remember the couple of months that he went to a Methodist church after his kid died? It probably wasn't a big deal. Or maybe Joe thought that nobody would ever look up his membership in any other churches in the area once he released this 1820 story. Alright, so that's the end of that rabbit hole, but I figured it was at least a slight contradiction of the recorded events as opposed to what actually happened, and at most was evidence of another one of Joe's bold-faced lies. Plus, it's a good thing to talk to missionaries about. when they come to the door and tell you that Joe was 14 years old and went into the woods to ask God about all the other religions, and Jesus said they were all abominations and their professors were wholly corrupt, ask the missionaries, if that's the case, why did Joe join the United Methodist Church in Harmony, Pennsylvania, less than 2 years before the first congregation of the Mormonite religion in Fayette, New York in 1830? Doesn't this seem like a glaring contradiction to God's will? I mean, I thought Joe was the second most perfect person on the planet, second only to Jesus, but he directly contradicted Jesus' explicit instructions. I mean, if you said this to a missionary or apologist, I would love to see how they try to weasel their way out of it. So anyway, let's get back to the storyline and away from this rabbit hole of counter-apologetics shit. In the mid to late 1828, we have a few interesting things happen with other big players than just Joe. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, so buckle in. In late summer of 1828, we had Lorenzo Saunders reportedly sighting Sidney Rigdon at the Smith residence in Palmyra, New York. And in fall, our buddy Ollie Cowdung moved from Vermont to tutor Joseph Smith Sr., who we know as Big Daddy Cheese, who was his third cousin once removed. And Ollie, customarily, boarded with the Smith family during this time. Big Daddy Cheese reportedly told Ollie about the plates at this time, saying that a marvelous work is about to come forth. Ollie also initiated into Freemasonry at the end of 1828. In February of 1829, Big Daddy Cheese visited Joe in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and had a revelation that a marvelous work is about to come forth. All of the players were beginning to fall into place. D-Day David Whitmer and Ollie met up in Palmyra, New York, knowing each other before this, and discussed the story of Joe and the gold plates. We can also presume that Sidney Rigdon went to visit his family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on his way from Palmyra to Mentor in late 1828, which would put him walking right past the Hale residence where Joe and Emma were living at the time. Rigdon went back to Mentor after this and converted Parley P. Pratt in early 1829 to Campbellite Baptist, which is what Rigdon was preaching at the same time, and they both started preaching baptism by immersion for the remission of sins. One quick thing to mention that's way back in this storyline is Sidney Rigdon mentioning to his fellow preachers, Adamson Bentley and Alexander Campbell, that a golden Bible will come forth. Bentley recalls it as happening in 1827, and Campbell recalls it as 1826. It was probably in the winter of 1826 as Rigdon had moved from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Bainbridge, Ohio, a little bit earlier in 1826. So let's go back to 1829. After Big Daddy Cheese had visited his son Joe in Harmony in mid-February, Joe received divine revelation in March that he should resume translating the plates and that the Lord would provide a scribe for this task. Magically, Ollie shows up in April of 1829. So let's read what Joe recalls on that morning of April 5th, 1829. This is from the Joseph Smith History, verse 66. Quote, "On the 5th day of April, 1829, Oliver Cowdery came to my house, until which time I had never seen him. He stated to me that having been teaching school in the neighborhood where my father resided, and my father being one of those who sent to the school, he went to board for a season at his house, and while there, the family related to him the circumstances of my having received the plates, and accordingly he had come to make inquiries of me." Verse 67. 2 days after the arrival of Mr. Cowdery, being the 7th of April, I commenced to translate the Book of Mormon, and he began to write for me. End quote. Do you guys want to know what I think? Well, of course you want to know what I think. That's why you're listening to the podcast. I personally believe that Joe was ready to throw in the towel after Not So Smarty Marty lost the 116-page transcript. Like we talked about earlier, Joe's life was really in the shitter since mid-1828, and he didn't have any way of authoring the Book of Mormon without Not So Smarty Marty watching over as the scribe, and he knew that he'd eventually be found out. Well, I think that Ollie, Hinchpin Rigdon, and D-Day David Whitmer, and, well, Big Daddy Cheese, wanted to convince Joe otherwise. I think that was the nature of Big Daddy Cheese's visit in February to convince Joe that the book was worth all the work that it would take. It was probably around this time that Hinchpin Rigdon gave Joe the edited copy of manuscript found, presuming that Rigdon had it at the time after he had edited it for production. After that, Ollie came along with all his book learnings and probably his marked up copy of the View of the Hebrews. I think things were coming together as originally planned, and Joe's lack of motivation to do the actual translation was the final sticking point. But, for once, Joe listened to his dad about going through with something, and the gigantic task of the Book of Mormon authorship officially began. Now, the church reports that the entire Book of Mormon was written in the 60 working day period from April 7th to late June 1829. The reason I say 60 working days when this was obviously more than 60 calendar days is because of some other things that happened that held up the authorship crew. Like on May 15th, when Joe and Ollie decided they needed to baptize and ordain each other to the Aaronic priesthood. Or on May 25th, when they baptized Samuel Smith, one of Joe's little brothers. I suppose I should have mentioned this earlier, but Samuel Smith was good friends with Ollie at this time, and actually accompanied him to Harmony, Pennsylvania to meet Joe in April 1829. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was living with Emma, Joe, and Ollie as well, given the timeline. Well, like I said, some things held them up a little bit, like lack of space inside the little home of Jesse Hale that Joe had purchased from his father-in-law Isaac. So D-Day David Whitmer, Ollie and Joe's friend, became the solution that everybody needed. Up to this point, it's assumed that Ollie and Joe were translating about 3 to 4 pages per day, which is hauling some serious ass in comparison to how things were going with Not So Smarty Marty. Oh, by the way, Marty had been barred from ever helping with translating the Book of Mormon ever again because of his supposed transgressions of losing their manuscript. Well, the roughly $100 that he gave Joe and Emma to help with moving and living expenses was drying up, especially with 4 people living under the one roof. In late May 1829, Joseph Knight Sr., a person we haven't heard from in a while, whose carriage Joe and Emma stole the night of September 21st, 1827, to supposedly get the plates, actually brought some supplies and a little bit of change to the overcrowded house to help support them a little bit longer. Those supplies didn't last long. Thankfully for everybody, D-Day David swooped in on or about June 1st, 1829, to move Joe, Emma, Ollie, and Sam to the Whitmer household in Fayette, New York. Here, Joe would find sanctuary from his father-in-law trying to collect on the mortgage note that Joe signed, and they would all be able to live free of charge, without worrying about daily chores or working for money. Even better than not having to worry about the usual frustrations of being a productive member of society, Joe found a house full of willing scribes and servants that bought whatever he sold, no matter how crazy it was. Joe's luck was really starting to turn around by this point, and not a moment too soon. Once they moved in here, it's theorized that they were translating somewhere between 8 and 10 pages per day. There are over 500 pages in the current Book of Mormon, and they were able to write it in about 60 days. But they didn't translate the book from beginning to end, starting with 1 Nephi and ending with Moroni. They translated the second half up to the end, and then after that, they went back and translated the first half up to where they had started. This might not make a lot of sense right now, so let me try to explain. First off, I need to cover what Mormons supposedly abridged to create the golden plates, where the entire Book of Mormon was supposedly translated from. But I'm going to list these chronologically and reference where it's found in the Book of Mormon. So first off, in the timeline of the book, we have the Jaredites. The journey of the Jaredites is recounted in the Book of Ether, which is the second to last book in the Book of Mormon. Joe kind of pulled like a reverse Tarantino and told the earliest story at the very end of the book. It's kind of weird. But the Jaredites supposedly came across an ocean in submarines, which took almost a year, 344 days. And that happened around 2500 BC, supposedly before the Tower of Babel fell, meaning that the Jaredites' language wasn't corrupted. They wiped each other out and left the first set of plates that we're aware of. To be precise, they left 24 metal plates and a stone tablet found by the Mulekites. They were found in the land northward, supposedly among the ruins of the destroyed Jaredite civilization. So that's the first set of plates that Mormon had possession of to abridge the golden plates. To get to the next set, we have to fast forward 1400 years to 600 BC. Here we come to the story of Lehi's family in pre-destruction Jerusalem. Lehi's family was directed to leave before Jerusalem was destroyed. They journeyed into the wilderness, but realized that they had forgotten something. So the family made camp. Lehi, Sariah, Laman, Lemuel, Sam, and Nephi were the names of all the family members. Customarily, no daughters' names were listed, so we don't know if there were daughters in there as well. So Lehi sent these 4 boys back to Jerusalem to obtain the brass plates from the evil King Laban. These plates were said to hold the records of the family, which probably meant that they were a brass plate version of the Old Testament, starting with the Pentateuch and ending with Isaiah. I'm not sure why or how, but after a few times going back and forth, Nephi, the youngest brother of the group, finally obtained the plates by smiting off the head of the passed-out drunk King Laban, and tricked Laban's servant Zoram to let him have the plates. So this is the second set of plates with religious inscriptions that we have brought over to the American continent. Not only did they supposedly exist in the possession of Lehi's family, but Nephi also transcribed some of the content of these brass plates into the first and second books of Nephi in the Book of Mormon. Those are the first 2 books. There's a good reason for this transcription, but hang in there with me for a minute because I'm trying to build a pretty big case here. So we have the 24 Jaredite plates and the plates of brass, but how do we know about the exodus of Lehi's family in the first place? Well, that brings us to our third set of plates. But what we read in the Book of Mormon was taken from the gold plates, which was Mormon's abridgment of all the relevant plates he could find. But the entire record of Lehi's family and the descendants are included in a set called the small plates. Don't let the name fool you, because according to the Book of Mormon, we are talking about hundreds, if not thousands, of these metal plates with inscriptions on them that cover the birth and death of dozens of cities, thousands of people in warring tribes, and countless rulers in a system of theocratic judges, spanning from 600 BC to 150 BC. Remember, Mormon just abridged all the important parts and wrote them in the golden plates, which is what Joe supposedly had. These small plates make up the first 6 books of the Book of Mormon. That's 1st and 2nd Nephi, Jacob, Enos, Jerem, and Omni. Then, in between Omni and Mosiah, we have a little book of 1 chapter with 18 verses in it called The Words of Mormon. This book was supposedly written in 385 AD and describes who Mormon is and the task he's been given. But that's not the only thing it does. It uses a guy named King Benjamin to clean up the mess that's made by the time Omni comes along and helps the book transition into the next book called the Book of Mosiah. The way Mormon does this is he says he's going to start abridging from the large plates, whereas he's been pulling from the small plates before now. The large plates are the 4th set of plates referred to by this time, not including the gold plates themselves. The large plates contained the following books: Mosiah, Alma, Helaman, and 3rd and 4th Nephi. These supposedly make up the large plates, and if you've ever read the Book of Mormon, you'll know why, because Alma never fucking ends. Then after 4th Nephi, there's a book called the Book of Mormon, not to be confused with the Book of Mormon itself. This little Book of Mormon inside the Book of Mormon is Mormon's testimony of what is happening in a huge battle that's commencing between the Nephites and the Lamanites. Mormon dies in this battle and hands off the gold plates in their unfinished form to his son Moroni, so he can finish abridging all the records of the nation onto the golden plates. This happened around 420 AD. That's right, 420. Look it up. Moroni immediately jumps into the Book of Ether, which is the record of the Jaredites that we talked about earlier. Somehow, Moroni found these plates that were 2,900 years old at this point, and was able to translate them from the uncorrupted God's language, which was supposedly written down as Reformed Egyptian, and transcribed them onto the surfaces of the gold plates. The Book of Ether is one of the smaller books in the Book of Mormon, even though it covers the trials and tribulations of an entire ancient race of people on the American continent, complete with cities and buildings and all. After Moroni translates this book into the Book of Ether on the gold plates, he adds his own little tidbit book called the Book of Moroni to finish off the entire Book of Mormon and wrap things up into one nice little package. He also inserts his own little call to prayer, saying that if you read the Book of Mormon and pray that God will reveal the truthfulness of it to you, that you'll get a burning in your bosom or some other vague emotive confirmation. That pretty much covers the chronology and the basic supposed source material for the Book of Mormon, and explains how it all came together into one set of gold plates by the hands of father and son Mormon and Moroni. So the gold plates supposedly make up the fifth set of religious and historical plates that we have record of. So if we consider this timeline as a whole, why was it written so disjointedly and weird? Why was the very beginning of the story shoehorned in as the second to last book? Why does Mormon pop in at the end of the small plates to help us transition into the large plates? Why are there a bunch of Isaiah verses in 1st and 2nd Nephi? What the fuck is going on? None of it seems to make any sense. Well, let's look at it more critically, with some inferences of our own. Considering what we know about Joe's authorship timeline, first, Joe was translating the Book of Lehi with Not-So-Smarty Marty as his scribe in harmony. Once these were lost, or stolen, or hidden from Joe, or whatever happened to them, God took away Joe's ability to translate, quote-unquote, for a season. Then, Joe was scared that somebody still had the 116 pages that Marty took, so he received divine revelation from God with the perfect solution. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the Doctrine and Covenants section 10, which was actually one of the earliest revelations from Joe that we have record of. I'm going to read verses 28 through 45 to bring in the context of Joe's mindset. Hopefully it will be as clear to you as it is to me that Joe was in full defensive mode, trying to get Marty to believe that he was too for realsies. This starts out verse 28, quote, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, woe be unto him that lieth to deceive, because he supposeth that another lieth to deceive. For such are not exempt from the justice of God. Now behold, they have altered these words, because Satan saith unto them, He hath deceived you, and thus he flattereth them away to do iniquity, and get thee to tempt the Lord thy God. Behold, I say unto you, that you shall not translate again those words which have gone forth out of your hands." That was the Book of Lehi, the 116 pages. "For behold, they shall not accomplish their evil designs in lying against those words. For behold, if you should bring forth the same words, they will say that you have lied, and that you have pretended to translate, but that you have contradicted yourself. And behold, they will publish this, and Satan will harden the hearts of the people to stir them up to anger against you, that they will not believe my words. Thus Satan thinketh to overpower your testimony in this generation, that the work may not come forth in this generation. But behold, here is wisdom. And because I show unto you wisdom, and give you commandments concerning these things, what you shall do, show it not unto the world until you have accomplished the work of translation." Meaning, don't show any parts of it until you've completed the entire Book of Mormon. "Marvel not that I said unto you, Here is wisdom, show it not unto the world. For I said, Show it not unto the world, that you may be preserved. Behold, I do not say that you shall show it unto the righteous. But as you cannot always judge the righteous, or as you cannot always tell the wicked from the righteous, therefore I say unto you, hold your peace until I shall see fit to make all things known unto the world concerning the matter. And now, verily I say unto you, that an account of those things that you have written, which have gone out of your hands, is engraven upon the plates of Nephi. Yea, and you remember, it was said in those writings that a more particular account was given of these things upon the plates of Nephi. And now, because the account which is engraven upon the plates of Nephi is more particular concerning the things which, in my wisdom, I would bring to the knowledge of the people in this account. Therefore, you shall translate the engravings which are on the plates of Nephi, down even until you come to the reign of King Benjamin, or until you come to that which you have translated, which you have retained. And behold, you shall publish it as the record of Nephi, and thus I will confound those who have altered my words. I will not suffer that they shall destroy my work. Yea, I will show unto them that my wisdom is greater than the cunning of the devil. Behold, they have only got a part or an abridgment of the count of Nephi. Behold, there are many things engraven upon the plates of Nephi, which do throw greater views upon my gospel. Therefore, it is wisdom in me that you should translate this first part of the engravings of Nephi, and send forth in his work. End quote. Is this starting to make sense yet? Remember earlier when I detailed the books and talked about this tiny little book in between Omni and Mosiah called Words of Mormon? I said it seems to clean up the mess that's made by the time we get to Omni. What I mean by that is, in like 8 verses, King Benjamin wipes out thousands of Lamanites in multiple cities, effectively hitting the reset button on the Nephite-Lamanite dynamic. Well, in my opinion, this is because Joe remembered the basic storyline that he had talked about in the Book of Lehi, which was 116 pages he translated with Marty, and he knew that he had to cover all the main points he talked about in that manuscript so far. But because it was written from a different perspective, that of Lehi's son Nephi, the details in between the larger events could be totally different as they were written from a different person's perspective. And the reason I think that Joe included a bunch of Isaiah verses in the first and second books of Nephi was he needed to make up a lot of ground, and he needed to talk about a lot of theology. So he just copied and pasted from the King James Bible, just straight up. Bunch of Isaiah verses, copied them, popped them in 1st and 2nd Nephi, and was able to take up a ton of space and make all kinds of confusing, odd theological conundrums that don't make a whole lot of sense, and talking about grafting branches onto trees, and it's just a mess. So by doing things this way, Joe was actually able to cover up his tracks, while still preserving the same basic storyline to an extent that not-so-smarty Marty might believe. Joe did something else here that was absolutely genius to cover his tracks. He altered the order in which he authored things to make them fit better with what had to be included in the beginning part of the book leading up to King Benjamin. So when Ollie came along and they started working together, they began translating from Mosiah, the large plates, and worked their way all the way to the end of the book. After that, they went back and translated from the beginning, which was 1st Nephi, and worked their way all the way up to Omni, which was the end of the small plates, and was also the end of the storyline that it was included in the 116 pages that Marty supposedly lost. Coincidentally, Omni goes to page 143 in the current Book of Mormon, which would equal to right around 115 pages if it was written on foolscap paper, which the 116-page Book of Lehi was. Isn't it odd how it just fits right in like that? So after Joe, Ollie, Samuel Smith, D-Day David Whitmer, John Whitmer, and Peter Whitmer were done writing everything up to Omni, Joe included this little hinge pin book, Words of Mormon, to tie everything together as best he could. At the end of the Book of Mormon, Moroni takes the completed gold plates to the Hill Cumorah and buries them there. Fast forward about 1400 years, and this is the same Hill Cumorah that Joe supposedly dug the plates from in 1827, after being visited by the angel Moroni frequently, starting in 1823. As the story goes, there was a massive battle on this hill. Millions of Native American Jews slaughtered each other with swords, spears, and arrows. Most of them are equipped with leather or metal armor. Moroni is literally the last Nephite left that hasn't been slain or turned dark-skinned due to iniquity. And, well, he's basically doomed to wander the wilderness until God sees it fit to finish him off. His book basically ends by saying, "All right, I'm just going to go off in this corner and die now, so try not to shed any tears for me." And then the Book of Mormon's over. That's it. So that pretty much covers the authorship and timeline of the Book of Mormon, and it explains why it's so disjointed and weird and nonsensical. So let's take a minute to talk about the plates. I'm not talking about the gold plates, I mean the other ones. The supposed oldest plates are the 24 that the Jaredites recorded on that were found by the Mulekites and later abridged by Moroni into the Book of Ether. They were supposedly written in God's language, which is the Reformed Egyptian that Joe loved and talked about so much. Then we have the brass plates, which were a metallic copy of a significant portion of the Old Testament. They were probably written in, ancient Hebrew or something like most copies of the Old Testament were, and included everything leading up to Jeremiah, the end of Isaiah. We can infer this because Isaiah is the book just before Jeremiah, and Nephi quotes extensively from Isaiah in 1st and 2nd Nephi, once he gets the brass plates from Laban. According to my King James Bible, Isaiah ends on page 941. Now, I know that ancient Hebrew doesn't contain any vowels and has odd sentence structure and whatnot, but it couldn't have been that much shorter than how many pages are in the current Bible. A quick Google search brings up a metal weight calculator. If we are extremely generous with the limitations of this calculation, the brass plates would have come in at just under 300 pounds. That's with just 700 sheets of 5-inch by 7-inch plates of really low quality brass that are only 1 millimeter thick. Nephi was pretty buff to carry these plates with him for miles from Jerusalem to where his family was camped out in the wilderness. But he probably didn't have anybody attacking him along the way, so he didn't have to waste any strength on superpower knockout punches like Joe did. So next we have the small plates, which were recorded on, I don't know what kind of metal. It doesn't specify. In fact, nobody knows what metal the Nephites used to record the history on the small plates. But there were probably thousands of them. They were the recordings of every Nephite historian that lived on the American continent from around 600 BC to 150 BC. Everything was included, down to every time there was a battle or a warring tribe took over a new area, or a judge changed position, or a prophet was called to preach repentance to the Nephites, or Lamanites, or Zoramites, or Amalekites, or any of the otherites. This would have been thousands of records, all abridged by Mormon into the gold plates. Luckily for us, I guess. Then we have the large plates, which cover the destruction and overtaking of dozens of cities, both large and small, by warring native tribes. Jesus appears on the American continent and preaches gobbledygook nonsense about repentance and following him, all conveyed with way too many verilies. Just like the small plates, we don't have any record of what these plates were made out of, as it isn't specified anywhere. We can reasonably assume that they were the same material as the small plates were written on, but there's no way of knowing for sure. If we look at the current Book of Mormon, which is a translated version of the abridged version of all of these plates, and compare the small plates section to the large plates section, just by sheer quantity of information, the large plates portion of the Book of Mormon is about 3 times the size of the small plates portion. So if there were hundreds or thousands of engraven plates of information for just the small plates, there must have been a significant amount more source plates to comprise the large plates section of the book. This would reasonably mean tens of thousands of metal plates used as source material for the latter 5 books in the Book of Mormon. These were presumably all written in ancient Hebrew because the Native Americans are supposedly descended from the family of Lehi, which fled Jerusalem in 600 BC. After all of this, we get to the gold plates, the most impractical and idiotic fucking metal to try to use as a book. It's a bridge from all these thousands and tens of thousands of plates that are supposedly hidden in some cave somewhere in North America. Mormon and then Moroni carried these fucking things around the wilderness for years, fleeing death from the evil, dark-skinned Lamanites. And somehow, Mormon was able to read all of these records of plates and compile them all into the golden plates, while still on the run the entire time. Not only that, but he would have had to translate everything from ancient Hebrew to Reformed Egyptian, so Joe could read it all in one language and then translate it into Elizabethan English in the mid-1800s. The only book that wouldn't have been translated from ancient Hebrew was the Book of Ether, because it was written by people who didn't have their language corrupted by the Tower of Babel falling. But that was included by Moroni, Mormon's son, and it's like 15 chapters long. 6 if you look at the original 1830 print of the Book of Mormon. The reason I seem to be talking about this so redundantly is so you, the listener, can really understand and appreciate how ancient record keeping went in the Book of Mormon. Because it didn't happen like this anywhere else on the fucking planet! Nowhere have we found ancient plates of brass, steel, bronze, gold, aluminum, iron, or any other metal alloy that's anything like what's in the Book of Mormon. Nowhere! Only in Joe's little fairy tale do we hear about ancient religious texts being carved into metal plates in the time frame he talked about. Metal was way too rare and hard to make in the ancient world. The supposed brass plates that contained almost 85% of the Old Testament didn't even exist in the pre-Roman Middle East. The earliest evidence we found of brass plates containing any Jewish religious text was in India, and they were from 1024 AD, 1600 years after Lehi's family supposedly fled Jerusalem. And those things were so crude and bulky that the 55 plates that were found weighed 216 pounds together and had a mere 2,500 lines of text on them. Nowhere in all of history and archaeology do we find anything like what's in the Book of Mormon. The way the Book of Mormon supposedly got to us is truly, by all means, impossible and completely fucking ridiculous. So tell me, is this really the most correct book that ever existed? If the Mormon God is real, I'm sure going to have a lot of questions when I die. Just now, I only talked about the lack of existence of the metal plates as religious or historical texts. Now, let's talk about the Hill Cumorah itself, the most damning piece of all Mormon theology. Remember how I said there was a massive final battle there with millions of people with swords and armor and shields and all kinds of metallic wartime furnishings? Well, those don't just deteriorate when they're buried in the ground for some 1,600 years, nor do the bones of millions of slain soldiers. Why don't we just dig into the supposed Hill Cumorah a couple of feet to unearth countless piles of priceless ancient artifacts? If the LDS Church claims that the Book of Mormon is truly the most correct book on the planet, which they emphatically do, the archaeological evidence buried in that hill would instantly verify everything that the book claims. Why haven't we dug it up yet? Fuck it. Give me a backhoe and a ground-penetrating radar system for a week, and I'll damn sure find what we're looking for. And that's without a massive team of archaeologists. I'll even do the work pro bono. I'll pay for the backhoe rental. I'll replace the dirt after I dig it up, provided I don't find anything with the digging. I'll even preserve the sod and lay it down exactly how I found it when I started digging. I'm dead goddamn serious about this offer. I will be happy to be the first person to dig into that hill and verify the claims of the Book of Mormon. I'll even happily publicly apologize to the Mormon Church presidency for anything fallacious I've said in this podcast with regards to sheer lack of archaeological evidence. Please don't think I'm joking when I say this. I'll take a week off work and pay for the plane ticket myself to do it. I'll cover all the expenses and the time just for the sake of pursuing knowledge. Let's make this shit happen. Oh, wait. We can't. In fact, nobody can even come near that hill with a fucking teaspoon to try and excavate any evidence for or against the Book of Mormon. The Mormon Church owns it and has a massive granite monument somewhere near where they think Joe might have maybe sort of dug up the plates. And please don't think that this hill is miles wide and thousands of feet tall like a small mountain that's just called a hill. It's a dinky little mound of earth with a big white spire with a gold angel Moroni on top of it. It's barely big enough to ice block or sled down. If you happen to lay on your side and roll from the top to the bottom, you'd only be moderately dizzy from the experience. Superman could leap it with the propulsion from one fairly sizable burrito fart. A few thousand people could scarcely stand on the hill, let alone a few million people battle and die on it. Yet, this is the most important hill in all of Mormon history, and the original housing ground of the precious gold plates, chest plate, Urim and Thummim, and possibly even the Sword of Laban. The address of this hill is apparently 603 State Road 21, Palmyra, New York. If there happen to be any listeners in New York that just so happen to live near this or know where this is, I think it would be pretty awesome for you to get a selfie with a hill in the background and post it in the comments section of this episode on Facebook. I know this is probably asking a lot and nothing will ever come of it, but it's at least worth a shot, right? So let's talk about why Joe was so fascinated with hills in the first place to close out this week's episode. We need to talk about the mound builder mythology. I've made reference to it a few times without explaining what it is very well. The time frame we've been talking about up to this point was during an age of European migration throughout the American territory. Along with this migration came an insatiable need for exploration. The unexplored American territory was a land of untamed wilderness and unkilled savages. To put some perspective on this localized knowledge of the Western territories, Lewis and Clark had only returned from their grand 2-year exploratory mission in 1806, merely a year after Joe was born. Much like playing a real-time strategy video game, the fog of the unknown territory was often terrifying, or at very least, it sparked the interest and speculation of a lot of people. Well, with all this exploration, people were finding and uncovering all kinds of elaborate ruins and amazing feats of ancient engineering and architecture. In South and Central America, dozens of ancient uninhabited ruins and pyramids were being found by explorers. Last historical episode, we talked about the source text for the Book of Mormon. I listed dozens of books at the end of that episode that had a theme of general inquisition concerning the origin of all of these ancient American ruins. Well, the people at the time had a certain opinion of the red-skinned savages that inhabited the land. They believed that these evil and unruly people could never be responsible for creating such amazing works of architecture and art. After all, they were just teepee-dwelling nomads that cut the scalps off any white-skinned person that came near them, right? Well, this was the motivated reasoning behind the mound builder mythology. People, not just lay people, but educated people that devoted their life to studying these ruins, surmised that there must have been some other explanation for these things coming into existence. I mean, come on, the Indians obviously weren't smart enough to do anything this cool. Some people excavated mammoth bones and asserted that they were bones from an ancient race of giants that built all these mounds and architecture. Other people found artifacts that were Spanish and thought that they were deposited there thousands of years before by the people that built the ruins, possibly the Spanish people as well. Some even had the crazy idea of ancient Jews sailing across the ocean to the void American continents for the sheer purpose of multiplying and replenishing this new promised land. But let's face it, that's just fucking stupid. Well, some of these ruins were actually buried in hills from normal weather and erosion and had to be excavated. But geographical and meteorological studies were nowhere near what they are now, of course. Now we have natural ways of explaining how these ruins were buried, but all they could do back then was say some intelligent being was responsible for what they were finding. Of course, the natives were far too stupid to handle such a task, so obviously it was some race of white people or giants or some other intelligent species. There are some other nuances to the full mound builder myth, but that pretty much covered the basics to an extent that we can be satisfied with for now. It just goes to show you the nuances of the mindset of the people at the time. They had this white superiority complex. that only white people, white Europeans, or apparently Jews were smart enough to do anything like this, or to make any of this architecture. But it was completely ridiculous, because if you look at any of the ancient Mayan or Aztec or any of the other ancient ruins, go to Utah and look at some of the cliff dwellers. I mean, those people are absolutely amazing. Some of the places that they build civilizations in these crevices of rocks were just absolutely fascinating, and they were obviously a very, very intelligent people. They weren't just nomads living in teepees, killing and eating buffalo. I mean, these people were human beings. They were just as inventive as any other human beings were at the time. They just had different materials that were around them to build their civilizations with. So, all of that being said, this kind of serves to give us a little window into the mentality of Joseph Smith. Everything that's in the Book of Mormon is a manifestation of what Joe considered to be fact at the time, or what his worldview included. And we can easily refute everything that's in it. I mean, the Book of Mormon, if you try and take a skeptical and fact-based view of the Book of Mormon, it's just ridiculous. It doesn't hold up to any level of scrutiny. The DNA evidence, archaeological evidence, everything, any piece of evidence that you try and get for the Book of Mormon completely falls apart. That's why Farms and Fair were created by the Mormon Church. There were these organizations that were just created for the sole purpose of trying to gain archaeological evidence, or literally any evidence to support the Book of Mormon. And so far, both foundations have come up completely dry. You can look on fairmormon.org. It's just a Mormon apologist website. Search their site for archaeological evidence. Even they come by it fairly honestly and say, well, we really don't know where the evidence is for the Book of Mormon, but that's only because we don't know exactly where the Book of Mormon took place. It could have been in South America. It could have been somewhere in Central America, but that all falls apart when you talk about the Hill Cumorah, because the Hill Cumorah is where this massive battle ended up happening at the end of the Book of Mormon, where Moroni deposited the plates and where Joseph, 1,400 years later, went and dug up the plates. Trying to make any sense of the Mormon religion is a challenge in and of itself. There's no possible way for somebody that's intellectually honest to look at the facts surrounding the Book of Mormon and surrounding Joseph Smith himself and still come by a belief in the Mormon Church honestly. You can believe in the church. You can believe in the teachings of the apostles, because oftentimes they teach good, family-centered doctrines that are, that make you feel good and stuff, and they're very community-based. You can believe in the church itself. But when you actually look at the history like we're looking at right now, it's so easy to see that Joseph was a fucking liar, a fraud, and just out to get as much money and notoriety and fuck as many chicks as he possibly could. And that's all we need to chalk it up to. Joseph Smith was no different than any other cult leader that's had the same ideas that he has of creating their own religion and getting a following behind them and using that at their own whims. I did have one piece of listener mail to talk about. So Nick D sent in an email, and I'm just going to read it real quick. It's pretty short. Hey Bryce, I just listened to the second most recent episode on plagiarism. I'm personally a supporter of the view of the Hebrews theory you went over. One critical fact I've realized, though, is that Joseph Smith would have had to be aware of the book in 1823 for this theory to work. Remember, he first told the idea to his family in the fall of 1823, and View of the Hebrews was first put out that summer. We know for a fact that Joseph conceived of the idea in 1823 because of the issue with Alvin dying before he could come to the second yearly meeting with Moroni on the autumnal equinox of 1824. I can't decide whether Joseph having the idea 101 days after the View of the Hebrews hit the shelves helps or hurts our theory. Seems like a tight time frame for Joseph to come in contact with the book, become familiar with it, and hatch his plan. Thoughts? Nick. Well, Nick, I really appreciate you sending in this message, and I do have some thoughts on it. Honestly, I think what we're trying to do here is look at Joe as if he was an island in and of himself. Like, he was a person going to the library and picking up these books and reading them and hatching these plans all by himself. Well, I think that's kind of an incorrect way to look at Joseph, because he was living in the burned over district. This place was constantly, they called it the burned over district because the religious revivals were constantly just scorching the earth, and everybody would find somebody's new theology, like the Campbellite theology or the Anabaptist or whatever was hatched out of the burned over district, and they would take what they liked about it, latch onto it, and then tell all their friends. Well, the View of the Hebrews was published in Pulteney, Vermont by the pastor of Oliver Cowdery's congregation. We don't know for sure, but we think Ollie and Joe had contact with each other at this time and time before then. So to say that 101 days of a window of Joe revealing that he knew about the Gold Bible, only 101 days after the View of the Hebrews hit the shelves, I think if we say that that's something that hurts the theory, we're trying to imply that Joseph was responsible for a lot of his own ideas and that he was basically an island unto himself. But he was constantly influenced by preachers and by common writings and by all kinds of people that were just coming up with new theologies and new ideas and their own nuances to the Christian theology. And he was not alone in this. This was at the time of the boom of the printing press, and honestly, people were writing all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, if you try and read the View of the Hebrews, I mean, I got halfway through it and I couldn't read it anymore because it's just so confused and combobulated and just horrible pieces of theology just piecemealed and chunked together, talking about the ancient Hebrews and ancient religious sects that were part of Hebrew theology, and how likely it is that that's what it was involved in influencing the Native Americans, right? If you try and read it, it's just gobbledygook. It's fucking nonsense. So honestly, I think that the simple fact that Joe came out with his revelation about this Golden Bible in 1823, just 101 days after the View of the Hebrews hit the shelves, I think it really, really helps to bolster the theory. Because Joe didn't talk about any details when he talked about this 1823 revelation. He just said that you're going to be called to bring forth an ancient work. That's pretty much all he said. There was hardly anything with details or any theology in it. So by just those simple criteria, I think that we can probably latch on to considering it as something that bolsters the View of the Hebrews authorship theory. But, I mean, all that being said, I kind of made a mess of everything there because I'm just rattling off the top of my head. But I did really want to thank you for sending in the email, Nick. And, if anybody else has questions or wants to challenge me on a claim that I make, please feel free to send in an email. I'm happy to talk about or explain anything that I talk about. Please feel free. I mean, I want this to be a dialogue. I don't want it to be a monologue. I did need to splice in a little bit of a correction here. I got an email from a guy named Brad, and he made me aware of a mistake that I made. In episode 16, I said that B.H. Roberts was a Mormon historian who read No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brodie. She wrote it in 1949, which brought to light the connections in View of the Hebrews to the Book of Mormon. I was completely mistaken in that because B.H. Roberts kind of died in 1933, like 16 years before No Man Knows My History was even published. So Fawn Brodie actually took a lot of her information from B.H. Roberts. So B.H. Roberts actually did the study comparing the Book of Mormon and the View of the Hebrews long before Fawn Brodie even dove into the connections between the two texts. So Fawn Brodie actually got her information from B.H. Roberts. The guy that I was thinking of was Hugh Nibley. He's the Mormon historian who wrote No Ma'am, That's Not History. And that was a Mormon rebuttal to No Man Knows My History, and it was full of ad hominem attacks, and it was a horrible piece of literature. So I was completely mistaken, and I do want to say thank you, Brad, for making me aware of my mistake, and I didn't need to make that correction. One last thing that I did have to do before wrapping up tonight was thank the newest patrons we have. First off, I wanted to thank David Michael. That's right, the world-famous David Michael of the My Book of Mormon podcast is the newest NAMO juvenile delinquent. Thank you, David, for your pledge to support the show. I really do appreciate it. I know that you kind of did it selfishly so you could access the Patreon content, which that's cool. I don't mind. You know, that's why I put it out there, to motivate people to get interested to sign up as a patron. So I just wanted to say thank you, David. That's awfully nice of you. And last but certainly not least, there's a new NAMO presence that has been accessed that's come down the ranks. I'm still trying to confirm the existence of this something. It's some presence beyond a demon. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm hoping that in another couple of weeks here, I'm going to have some kind of intel on what this presence is. It's some horrible demon type of thing that's become something so much more than just a mere NAMO demon. That's all I can say for now. There's too much at stake. I did have one very special donation to mention real quick and thank somebody for. You guys may remember Jay from last episode. He and I had a discussion. He's the ex-Mormon gentleman living in California, and we had a really fun, candid discussion just about everything Mormonism. Well, Jay has done a lot to support the show. He's been in contact for a long time, talking Mormonism, talking all kinds of very, very fascinating stuff. And I mean, like I said, he's given me some leads on some interesting topics that I've had to research and, well, report back on. And it's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate the acquaintance that I made with Jay. He's just a great, genuine guy. There's so much more that you guys didn't hear in the episode that we talked about that was just so fascinating. It was interesting to learn much more about Jay. Well, Jay has given one-time donations, and he's been a patron for a long time, but recently he sent me an email. This email had a listing in it for an Amazon.com order, and the order entailed 5 books of Mormon history that have been on my wish list for a long time. They are Dan Vogel's early Mormon documents, and it's a 5-volume set of books that, well, I mean, quite frankly, the amount of information and the documents that are in there, I can't even scarcely try to wrap my mind around right now. I can't even imagine what's in there. Because as my research is going right now, I have to reach to the very far corners of the internet to find some of the documents and some of the things that I'm reporting on here. But this 5-volume set is just chocked full of nothing but early Mormon documents, as the title suggests, and they're all in one place, listed in what I assume to be chronological order. I have yet to see them. Well, Jay was nice enough to attach one line in this email with the link, and he said, "Are you interested?" And I replied back, fuck yes, please, absolutely. And he was willing and kind enough, and out of the goodness of his heart, he donated this set and just ordered it from Amazon and shipped it to my house. Jay, you are seriously so awesome. I hope you consider me a friend, because I absolutely, really, really appreciate everything that you've done, and I am really proud to call you my friend. So thank you so much. I can scarcely express the gratitude that I'm feeling for this very kind action. It's something that I wanted for a while, and I know it's going to save me a lot of time and anguish with researching certain hidden Mormon documents, and nobody has ever given me such a thoughtful and kind gift ever. So, Jay, thank you for being the great guy that you are. Just thank you so much. One other thing that I did want to mention was a little special project that I'm starting to work on. I posted an episode on Patreon that's just a pilot episode of this project, and I'm interested in any feedback that anybody's willing to give. You have to be a patron in order to listen to it, but anybody that's at $1 an episode or more is going to have access to Patreon. So that being said, I'm really hoping to get feedback. I want you guys to listen, to give me your thoughts. I'm really looking forward to it. I think the pilot went pretty well. Looking forward to what's going to happen and how the next project is going to morph into, the next chapter. That was just one thing that I had to mention real quick. Well, I think that pretty much sums up this episode for today. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.